Hey everyone, this is Bulbatrainer. First off, I wanted to give a massive shout out to PrimaDiva for redesigning the thumbnail for my last video. It's amazing work and I really appreciate it. Check out her YouTube down below where she covers really interesting topics like convergent evolution and how Pokemon could evolve in the real world. Second, I want to welcome my new subscribers and say thanks to all of you for sticking around. Starting off on YouTube isn't easy, but having you all there really makes my day, and I really appreciate everyone who likes, comments, or even just watches what I have to say about the Pokemon world. Finally, I want to state that this video, and all of my theories, are just that, theories. Pokemon hasn't always been super careful about canon, and Pokeballs themselves have various inconsistencies in universe. What I'm attempting to do with this video is condense things into an acceptable timeline. There may be a character's dialogue or magazine article that contradicts me, but any long-running media franchise is going to have these sorts of errors, and it's all just in good fun. That being said, if you have thoughts or comments on this video or polite critiques, I'd be thrilled to see them down below. Today's video is all about two of my favorites coming together, history and Pokemon. I'm not tackling the larger topic of the history of the Pokemon world itself yet, but rather the history of the Pokéball. Of course, a video like this was always going to come naturally to me, but I'm hoping that my other video on the possibility of the Pokéball being a weapon here got you excited. I get it, it's hard for regular people to get excited about history the way a geek like myself can, but this is the history of a fantasy world, so it should be more fun. Let's dig into the history of the Pokéball. In order to find the history of the Pokéball, we have to go back to a time before there was any technological ways of capturing Pokemon. We know that if we go back far enough in time, Pokemon were once seen as equal to humans. There's evidence in the Japanese versions of Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum that humans and Pokemon once married, and even the English version makes it clear that the differences between the two were minimal. So I'm gonna go ahead and assume that there weren't Pokeballs during this period. I don't keep my significant others in cages, or in energy limbo. I've brought up this point before, and I suppose it's a little odd from our perspective, but I'm using it as a starting point to assume that there was a time before any form or variant of Pokeballs were used. If humans and Pokemon could live side by side without the Pokeballs though, why would they be created in the first place? I don't keep my friends locked up either, and especially as the series has gone on, the friendships and partnerships between humans and Pokemon becomes more and more emphasized, so what gives? Well, while the primary purpose of a Pokeball is capture, it's also about control. Generally speaking, the human who originally threw the Pokeball is the primary partner of that Pokemon. Their orders are usually obeyed above others, even in the case of newly acquired Pokemon that wouldn't have had time to form a bond with their trainers. Records of humans trying to control Pokemon go back thousands of years though, and, I would assume, originally were for either nefarious purposes or for dangerous Pokemon. That humans want to control powerful Pokemon remains true even into the modern age, so it's not really a surprise to know that the ancients were doing it too. Nearly every instance of humans trying to control Pokemon with these ancient techniques or devices does so against the Pokemon's will, and generally is viewed as bad. There are 3 artifacts of note that have displayed the ability to control or influence Pokemon, but without permanence or capture. In Arceus and the Jewel of Life, Marcus uses armor to control some Pokemon. It would appear that he either thought it too risky to attempt to control Arceus directly, or he wouldn't have been able to, but this is mainly significant for the age. The usage of the armor is thousands of years old, and though used for nefarious purposes, it shows that human inventions, even this early on, can influence Pokemon. In fact, this time period may well represent the beginning of Pokemon and humans in the world, since Arceus was there in the first place to stop an impending disaster, and in mythologies around the world, it's very common that the closer you are to creation, the more frequently your deities will involve themselves in human affairs. So, I don't think it would be a stretch to say that the use of the armor occurred near the beginning of creation as the Pokemon world understands it. In the episode Control Freak, an ancient set of royal regalia are used in a similar fashion. allowing control over Pokemon in a finite area with the power of the staff and mask. This is important not only because of the age of the artifacts, but because they seem to be focused on the crystal in the staff, and that'll be important in a bit. Finally, the colored orbs that are used to control Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza. These are important again because of the implied age. Their description says they are imbued with ancient power. But also because we're not talking about controlling your run-of-the-mill Pikachu here. Groudon, Kyogre, and Rayquaza represent primordial forces in the Pokemon world. They are, in effect, deities, and the video explaining that will come, I promise. And they can be controlled to a certain extent with the orbs. These are crucial to the history of the Poké Ball itself, as it shows a desire in humans to control Pokemon from the very beginning, or at least for a long time, and it shows that the technological capabilities to achieve that goal are literally ancient. We might not know what went into the creation of the Queen's Regalia or the colored orbs, but we know that they are old, and they are far more advanced than anything we could create today. We might dabble in neurological interfaces that give us a degree of control over the mind, but conspiracy theories aside, we're a far cry from holding up a stone and expecting animals to just obey, and certainly not deities. While we can't know every application of the Queen's Staff, or even the armor, the orbs also show us another reason that technology capable of containing and controlling Pokemon would have been a necessity. In our world, we just don't have primeval forces of nature threatening to destroy us at every turn. But in the Pokemon world, even a rogue Arcanine could spell disaster. While humans and Pokemon are frequently partners, the sad reality is that they actually hold the true power for the most part. The ability to contain, divert, or control their power might be shown frequently being used for evil, but would have just been a basic survival tactic. So, humans discovered early on how to control Pokemon, but what about capturing them? Well, building on the concept of containing their power, eventually a natural conclusion would have been to keep them stored unless necessary. I'd imagine it would have started with similar reasoning of keeping the most powerful Pokemon in a safe place unless they were needed. As evidence of this, we're going to go back to the ancient puzzle of Pokemopolis. Now, in this video on whether or not the Pokeball could be a weapon, I mentioned the confusion I had with this episode. They say the devices containing the Pokemon actually holds them in a so-called shadow world. But regardless of whether or not that is actually the case, or if the Pokemon are indeed merely stored as energy in the objects, the fact remains that they were contained by the objects, and that their containment was for the greater good of the world at the time. When Gengar and Alakazam managed to free themselves, they were giant and not at all friendly. They were destructive forces that had to be stopped, and their respective objects were the key to keeping that power and destruction stored safely. Even the Jigglypuff, while not actively demolishing the planet around it, had a much more powerful sing attack. The idea of a Jigglypuff a mile away singing and it still affecting you is something that should make you uncomfortable. And it's not exactly shocking that the Pokemopolians locked it away. So, we may have seen some sneaky schemes, but we can see that the need to control and contain Pokemon may have also initially been born out of necessity. If Pokemon were frequently, or even occasionally carrying out epic and massive battles with each other that can and did cause damage, injury, and death, humans would have sought a way to stop it. The oldest objects that we know of behaving like an actual Pokemon is the personification of this desire. We don't see them being used willy-nilly for fun in battles. The orb at Pokélantis was thought/created to contain Ho-Oh, who was, arguably justifiably, destroying the city. Of course, it actually contained the king, which can also be seen as being for the same reason. The source of destructive actions was being contained. Similarly, a giant Pokeball was used to stop a violent Claydol in the episode Claydol, Big and Tall. The giant Pokemon was wreaking havoc and had to be contained. Interestingly, this giant Pokeball looks more like a traditional one than anything else before or since, making me wonder if the modern Pokeball is specifically designed to be ancient looking, like when we use Corinthian columns in our decorating. Again though, we're not seeing the technology being used for everyday applications. It's either for protection or antagonistic purposes, and that falls into line with the theorized reasons I've given. Giant or rampaging Pokemon needing to be contained. It doesn't seem that at this point the average Pokemon was just captured. They were probably domesticated in the way that we have domesticated cats and dogs. The average Pokemon was contained by behavior, not technology. But the technology was there. The Pokeball that contains the giant clay doll converted it to energy. Function is born of necessity, so the fact that we're still clumsily breaking apart atoms doesn't mean we're inferior to the Pokemon world, like I kind of implied in my last video. It just means that we haven't evolved with that need at our side. And based on what we've covered so far, I'd say we're actually pretty lucky we haven't. So, we've talked about the giant or powerful Pokemon contained by the technology, but what about on a smaller scale? Well, Spiritom's Pokédex entry tells us that it was first bound 500 years ago. Spiritomb is called mischievous and is capable of violent acts, but it's not really the threat that, say, Groudon is. Its Pokédex entries also say that it was bound to the keystone by a spell of some sort. But I think this would be a good time to bring up Arthur C. Clarke's third law, which states that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. If the area where the Spiritomb was first encountered and contained was not aware of technology being used to capture or control Pokemon in other areas of the world, and someone created a small Pokeball-esque device to capture it, they might have called it magic. The Pokédex entries for any Pokemon have to be taken with a grain of salt, and so I think it's fair to use this Pokemon's distinguishing characteristic, the odd keystone, as an example of early capture technology in use. And then we come to Lucario and the Mystery of Mew. Containing one of the most tear-jerking scenes in the entire franchise, this movie also contains the first use of casual containment of a Pokemon that we're aware of, or at least I am. The time period isn't exact, but it's stated to be hundreds of years. Like the Queen from Control Freak, told you, Sir Aaron uses a crystal set in a staff to contain Lucario. The entire point of the movie is their friendship and partnership in this life and beyond, and it's very clear that Aaron didn't view Lucario as anything less than a true friend, but he had the ability to keep Lucario sealed in a crystal on his staff. Convenience and safety, not for the world but for each other, seems to be the main reason it exists. Lucario could have been tired and Aaron could keep him in the crystal and continue his journey. If that journey took a particularly nasty turn, the crystal could be a place of refuge. And if he was about to go on a mission that would result in his death and didn't want his friend to share the same fate, the crystal could force him to stay away. Perhaps the crystal used in Aaron's staff is found naturally in the rocks that formed the odd keystone and the giant Pokeballs. The disparity between different sizes for different ancient artifacts that behave like Pokeballs could just be because different cultures had to use varying means to use the crystals. Before standardization began, each society discovered and used the technology in the way that they could. This occurs in our own world as well, rather frequently in fact. Multiple independent discovery is actually rather common, with everything from the existence of sunspots to jet engines being independently discovered by 2 or more scientists around the same time. If different people of an ancient Pokemon world all had the same problems of giant or violent Pokemon, it makes sense that they would have independently discovered a means of keeping them contained or controlled. It would also explain some odd bits of dialogue from the series, such as Drayden stating that Pokeballs didn't exist when he was little. Perhaps his town simply didn't receive them until corporations started producing them en masse, and he simply doesn't care to distinguish the difference. Either way, he didn't grow up with them, so his choice of words shouldn't be seen as a direct canon-making statement about the entire Pokemon world and its history. It would also explain how apricorns can lay claim to the title of First Pokeball, despite them being judged in terms of hundreds of years rather than the thousands we know the technology has been around. If the people of an older Johto region discovered how to implement the technology, crystal or otherwise, into a hollowed out apricorn shell, the size would make Pokeballs convenient enough that they could be used in the manner that we're used to. It would have introduced people to the concept of keeping Pokemon in an energy state for storage and convenience rather than out of necessity and fear, which would have led to their proliferation. A shift in the culture of the Pokemon world itself could have either occurred because of this or been responsible for it in the first place. You can have a team of 100 rotating Pokemon fit in a relatively small amount of space, which would have led to battles as more of a recreational hobby than just a professional sport or as a means to solve political and ideological conflicts. For a few hundred years, Johto would have produced the only practical Pokeball. However, eventually the technology would have spread and might have even been something of a hobby for people to pick up. This would explain how the captain in a ship full of shivers has contemporary-looking Pokeballs despite being about 100 years older than Lococo's Pokeball in Just Waiting on a Friend, and also why a statue in that episode represents a Pokeball closer to the appearance of the modern ball. Perhaps that Ninetales' master had merely taken up Pokeball design as some sort of pastime. It doesn't look exactly like we've come to expect and was much more fragile, but it does come close and does the job, and that would speak to an individual design. Since mass production doesn't seem to have been a thing until relatively late in the series, and because the Pokemon world has always had its central focus on, well, Pokemon, individuals taking up Pokeball design isn't too much of a stretch. One example from our own reality is PCs. For a long time, building a PC at home was a common hobby, as the options provided by manufacturers couldn't compare to something a serious user could make at home. These days, due to standardization and price cuts, a lot of people use pre-manufactured computers, enough that one could be mistaken for thinking that those are the only options, but it's just what's more common. Pokeballs could have seen a similar transformation. The time and cost of apricorn-based Pokeballs could have been prohibitive, and if the technology used was common enough, people would have been able to develop their own. When the Silph Company found a way to standardize and mass-produce the Pokeball, costs probably went down, and that model became the norm. It also would have gained more influence as the ability to store the balls themselves in the PC or at home using energy transfer took shape. I'll bet that some people in the Pokemon world still design and create their own capture devices, but they probably don't work with the PC transfer system and are therefore now more of a niche thing, with the exception of apricorn balls. These days, when people want to customize their Pokeballs, they add seals or stickers or gaudy ass diamonds. That's just the way industrialization works. Since the use of Pokeballs, if my theory is correct, is so common merely because of the convenience of storing, transferring, and utilizing Pokemon for traveling trainers, and being a trainer is so common, the Silph Co Pokeball or variants on its design became the go-to option. The ability for the ball to change its size, making it even more space efficient, would have also led to market dominance, and the utilization of the crystals mentioned earlier is still a possibility. I frequently call these parts of a Pokeball mirrors, but what if they're just thin strips of the same crystal, utilized in a way that makes the resource last longer while still being effective? And there you have it. In the Pokemon world, people needed to find a way to control Pokemon to stop their own destruction, or for villainous schemes. A relatively short time later, they discovered that Pokemon could also be contained, and again did so for their own protection. And then, as the technology could be scaled down, it started to become the norm for convenience and ease, and eventually led us to this little ball, as common to trainers as the pen is to us. Of course, some trainers prefer not to use them, and some Pokemon despise them, and that's understandable. But I think that this video and timeline provides us a rough estimation as to how the technology developed over time, moving from necessity to hobby to mere convenience, and also lets those of us who question everything, even in fiction, accept this seemingly futuristic technology as merely a natural development that occurred due to the needs of the Pokemon world and their unique circumstances. It does land a pretty hard blow to my previous theory of the Poké Ball as a weapon. If natural crystals rather than technology actually perform the core of the energy to matter conversion. But I'm big enough to admit that I could be wrong on that. And I could be wrong on this. Tomorrow they could release a manual that explains Pokeballs are actually formed by witches, or were a gift from Zapdos, or maybe you have a better theory. But with the information that we have available, I think that this theory on the history of the Pokeball nicely covers the supposed plot holes and inaccuracies. Disagree? Then tell me about it as politely as possible in the comments below. If I can admit that my own most recent theory might be busted by this one, I can handle your constructive criticism too. I had so much fun researching and condensing this theory, and if you made it to this point, I thank you. I want you all to know that I really appreciate it. I want to give one more shout out to both PrimaDiva and The ELBow for their art over the past couple of weeks. Check out their info in the description below if you want to get to know these two amazing individuals. If you liked this video, I would appreciate you showing it with a thumbs up. I also hope that you consider subscribing to help me grow my channel so I can continue to provide you with, hopefully fun, history lessons. I will see you all next time, and please, stay safe.